It says workshop XX in April XX. Oh well, too late now. Hi everyone, I'm Mark Elvis, and thanks Dragon John for arranging this exciting workshop. Before starting, I'd like to briefly express my gratitude to the late Professor Nguyen Van Loy. It was with his help at the Viet-Muong in 1997 and 1998 that I was able to do fieldwork on the Paco language in central Vietnam for my PhD dissertation. His research and publications have supported and inspired my own since then. He had more work to do. To some extent, I'm here today because of him. My research and publications have centered on Vietnamese language history, but also broadly Southeast Asian comparative and etymological studies. This has involved research on the language histories of Vietic and Austroasiatic overall, Chinese and Dai language histories, and the messy matters of language contact and typology in the Southeast Asian linguistic area. I've recently published about early Vietic syntax, another paper of Vietic ethno-linguistic historical notes, and I have forthcoming papers on an interdisciplinary approach connecting Vietic with the Damsan culture, and another on a typological summary of Vietic languages. In the last several years, I've expanded considerably into an interdisciplinary approach, bringing in insights from archaeology, historical texts, and ethnohistory. Historical linguists often focus on historical changes in phonology or syntax, semantics or phonology or etymology, but historical linguistic data and insights can also inform and be informed by explanation and exploration of ethnohistory. Today I'll present lexical data of two types, Vietic etyma and early Chinese loanwords, primarily loanwords in Vietnamese, but also other Vietic languages. I focused on the lexical data related to the cultural domain of the household, right? Household there. What I thought would be a narrow scope became much larger. So I am going to give you a whirlwind tour, my apologies, but I will of course share the materials later. The time frame for my talk today. Let's see here, oops, what's going on? Okay, that was slow. Okay, the time frame for my talk today begins with the Austroasiatic dispersal to the emergence of Vietic as a distinct language group, and then the Han Dynasty, that yellow row there. The Han Dynasty with the arrival of Sinitic speaking communities, plus the first several centuries of the Common Era. This is the before and after that's in the title of my talk. My topic is not about Vietnamese after the formation of Sino-Vietnamese. Oh, let's see, here's something. Okay. Oops. Where was I? Oh, I'm sorry. This is the before and after here. My topic is not about Vietnamese after the formation of Sino-Vietnamese, stemming to late Middle Chinese, but more like a pre-Proto-Viet-Muong stage. Oh, and by the way, for SEALS 2021 online this year, I'll similarly give a talk on Vietic and early Chinese loanwords, that before and after, but on the topic of grammatical vocabulary. So evidence, why is that slow? When I'm clicking, I'm not getting a, there we go. Evidence of this early Sinitic Vietic language and sociocultural contact is found in the Han-style tombs, as in this photo. As John Phan has noted, Vietnamese has the same word for tomb, grave, borrowed in different eras, the ma, mo, mo, with the earliest borrowing potentially in the Han Dynasty. Another related practice is the posting of steels in front of tombs, the Vietnamese bia, bia from Sino-Vietnamese bi, another early Chinese loanword. However, I have not found archaeological studies that specifically show steels in the region in this early period. Matching linguistic and archaeological data is important, but sometimes challenging. So let's get some key questions about the Vietic household. What lexical impact did Sinitic have on Vietic in the domain, semantic domain of the household? And then what does lexical data in Vietic and Vietnamese in the semantic domain of the household suggest about, first, the Sinitic Vietic language contact situation, in the first few centuries of that contact. Note I'm using the term Sinitic Vietic rather than Sino-Vietnamese because it wasn't Vietnamese and it wasn't quite Chinese as a language, Sinitic. And what about the daily lifestyle of Vietic peoples in the household prior to contact with Chinese culture and the Sinitic speech community versus the later situation of Northern Vietic or Viet-Muong after several centuries of such linguistic, social, and sociocultural contact? So the first question is kind of a language contact issue. The other one is more of a cultural issue, and they are intertwined. So let's consider the data and data sources and methods. So the Vietic lexical data and reconstructions. I've amassed several hundred Vietic etyma, but I've focused on about 100 items in the study, and based on 30 Vietic lects, you'll see what that means in the next slide. From where? From Ferlus's 1,000 plus Vietic reconstructions based on a dozen lects. Notice the dozen versus 30, plus over 150 of my proposed etymas so far. And the methods are, of course, based on phonological patterns. Crucially, I'm looking for things with multiple subgroups within Vietic, not just one, and those with Austroasiatic origins as well. Items are excluded when lacking solid evidence or they're labeled as loanwords and treated as such. Decisions are informed by ethnographic and archaeological data. For example, Ferlus reconstructed pineapple and guava. Both of those items are from South America, and they came only in the last couple of hundred years. There was no Proto-Vietic. There were no Proto-Vietic pineapples, sorry. And the items have been marked and sorted for semantic domains. So this is very helpful for exploring these things. By the way, this is this phylogenetic tree lists the languages for the lexical data. All 30 went into this tree, but for the talk today, while most of the data has been incorporated, I've gotten some recent acquisitions, relatively recent, and I still need to fully process them. But there's more than enough lexical data to make feasible, constrained working hypotheses here. As for the early Chinese loanwords, that is pretty much anything before late Middle Chinese, but hopefully it's a little earlier than that, but I don't have a way to really be refined in that matter. It's not that easy. Lexical data. I have several hundred items so far, still processing them, but about 160 for this study. I will simply say that I want that 160 to go down. I want it to go down. I want to cut out things that are less reliable. Of course, there are numerous published and unpublished works. I don't have time to go into all of them. Some of my own, but many other people, of course. They are ranked from medium to high certainty. I've excluded anything, of course, with zero certainty, but even low certainty. And how do I do this? How do I select and rank these? Of course, we consider Chinese historical phonological information. That's number one. Semantics as well. Then we check against neighboring languages, and we consider extralinguistic data, historical texts, archaeological studies, and such. And again, we've been sorted them by semantic domains. So this multifaceted method strengthens proposals and also provides a means of exclusion of items. So if you notice problematic phonological issues specifically in some words, please feel free to share them to help me cut down to a solid core of items. Now, obviously, there are caveats, and this is the small print, and I'm not going to go over the small print. There is no absolute certainty for anything, and new data comes in. Nevertheless, not all the Vietic reconstructions or posited early Chinese loanwords can be claimed valid with absolute certainty, but there is strength in numbers. Not all of these words must be valid to make general ethno-linguistic historical claims in the semantic domain. Okay, so the semantic subfields of the household include household structures and components, of course, the house itself, household items and implements, what's inside the houses, clothing and decorations, and food and cuisine. I'm not dealing broadly with agriculture. I'm not dealing broadly with politics or things like that. I try to restrict it as much as possible to the household, But again, it's difficult to make very fine cuts to it, so cast a rather wide net. So let's begin with the houses in the early period. These two photos show evidence of similar architectural structures, long houses with multiple posts along the edges and a large platform in the center. However, the one on the left is a diagram of a 3,500-year-old site in southern Vietnam, not northern, a site with all the trappings of the Austroasiatic Neolithic package, and I won't explain what that means exactly, but the one on the right is a photo of homes in a modern Katu village in central Vietnam. Some archaeological publications note that some practices of manufacturing in the region have remained to the present day. This ethno-historical continuity supports the possibility that the Vietic lexical reconstructions could possibly have substantial time depth back to these archaeological periods, archaeologically attested periods. Such structures hypothetically resemble at least some of what Chinese saw when they arrived, especially outside the more developed Co Loa area. But I'm still looking for comparable archaeological studies of early era homes, specifically in the north. It's hard to find everything you need. So it is possible. Okay, that's the bottom line. We can connect the words back to this period. So now to the lexical data. When I present these, please focus your eyes on the category column on the left and the glosses and colored highlight. There is comparative data throughout my talk, but no time to treat it carefully, okay? Vietic etyma in this table correspond to traditional homes in rural areas in the region. Since archaeological studies of these structures and weaving techniques, even from over 3,000 years ago, have comparable practices, these protoforms could hypothetically be connected to the Proto-Vietic stage. The core elements are there, such as house, roof, post, door, and supplemental parts and materials. The Vietic etyma of households, and daily items that are constructed so far include implements, containers. On the next slide, miscellaneous items and actions. The number of terms for containers on this page here does not match the substantial variety of these items in archaeological records, and I think this shows where additional linguistic fieldwork on such vocabulary would be useful. Hint, 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 people who might do linguistic fieldwork on Vedic languages. While on the next page here, continuing, while some metal and stone items are attested in the archaeological record, axe, drum, knife, not all of these words are. In fact, most of them are not. It's not possible to affirm or refute these as possible proto-language items, or even pre-Qin, before the Han era items. Hopefully, more sifting of archaeological data will reveal relevant evidence, and perhaps such linguistic data will encourage archaeologists to give attention to these matters. I talk with them. They'll listen, I'm sure they will. Lastly, I think it's worth mentioning that reconstructed terms for actions are evidence that archaeological data might not be able to provide, certainly not directly. Okay, Vietic terms for clothing and grooming. In the pre-Qin Southeast Asian archaeological record, cloths and textiles have mostly, not completely, disintegrated. However, garments are represented in imagery of Bronze era Damsun items, not just the drums, other kinds of objects have these images. As with architectural words, key elements in this domain of garments are represented. But not shirt-like upper garments, something that seems to be an early Chinese loanword. To weave, Vietnamese dan, is a deep Austroasiatic word. It's in all 13 of Austroasiatic branches. But the word for the conical hat non la, is most likely a later regionally spread word. This word is kind of really in Khmeric, Tuic, Vietic, a couple more in the close area, but it still could be from the pre-Qin period. as there are Damsun era bronze images of conical hats, but not quite what we expect. They look a little different, but pointy hats. Vai, cloth of cotton, is probably a word, almost undoubtedly a word from Sanskrit or Pali. It's regional, not just Vietnamese. So some items are true proto-language items, while others may be reconstructible later Vietic items, possibly still though when the Chinese arrived at the time of Chinese arrival. In the domain of food and drink, we are in territory with even less clear archaeological support. Getting these items in the record is difficult. Now, there is evidence of salt production in mainland Southeast Asia to the middle of the first millennium BCE. Okay, good. And we have a corresponding reconstruction of salted to salt, the Vietnamese mum, tasty mum. But of course, overall, there is little in the archaeological literature on prehistoric cooking practices and ingredients. So perhaps this lexical data could be good food for thought for archaeologists. Terrible pun intended. Okay. As for produce, most Vietic terms for produce are corroborated by botanical and archaeological information and are native to the region. Again, not pineapples, not guava, sorry. However, the histories of domestication of some items are still somewhat uncertain or have competing hypotheses. Regardless, some of these are reconstructed in Proto-Austroasiatic, you can see here, just a few of them, which deepens those etymas time depths. That's helpful. The theory of Austroasiatic groups as Neolithic agriculturalists who moved from southern China and spread throughout mainland Southeast Asia is reasonably well supported in many archaeological publications at this point. We'll see, but that's where the idea is leaning. Such studies often note millet and rice, as we have on this page here. But in one careful study, there is also mention of fruits, which we also have here, but not green leafy vegetables. I'm emphasizing that, no greeny leafy vegetables, not on this page either. Also, roots and tubers are noted in similar publications. Sidwell and Blinch, 2011, in talking about Austroasiatic also highlight that, but they are in the archaeological publications, roots and tubers. These foods are precisely what are in the Vietic reconstructions and sometimes Austroasiatic reconstructions. What are lacking are terms for green leafy vegetables, and as I will show in a little while, there are two early Chinese loanwords, always potential early Chinese loanwords, as well as a potential early Dai loan, Muong, for Muong, water spinach. Reconstructible Vietic terms for domesticated animals include precisely those recurring in archaeological literature for the Austroasiatic groups: pig, dog, pig, chicken. I have posited elsewhere that duck is a Dai loanword, but I have to say there is limited linguistic and archaeological justification for that. I'm less confident of the direction of borrowing. It's shared by the groups. Which way it went? Time will tell. The terms for goats and elephants requires more zooarchaeological data to understand those words' histories. They're reconstructible, but I don't know what the situation is. Finally, I recently published ethnolinguistic notes on Vietic, and one issue of note is betel nut chewing. More precisely, it's areca nut, but anyway, betel leaf. Archaeological evidence puts the practice of teeth blackening in northern Vietnam in the mid-first millennium CE. It's much earlier in insular Southeast Asia. The Proto-Malayo-Polynesian reconstruction for betel leaf is Bubulu, and you can see there for the Proto-Vietic and also Proto-Austroasiatic. That's the probable source for this word throughout mainland Southeast Asia, probable. But this is not a Proto-Vietic word introduced, but this practice and these words may have been part of the Vietic lifestyle when Han Chinese arrived in the region. Oops, where did I go? Oh, apologize. So let's transition to early Chinese loanwords here. Chinese style households had a presence in northern Vietnam from the Han Dynasty. I took this picture in that Hanoi Museum, not the History Museum, the Hanoi Museum, 2019. These Ming-Chi models, so-called Ming-Chi, provide a vivid image of the kinds of words to expect. Sorry. So Vietic has a solid core of elements of a home. And but among early Chinese loanwords, we see precisely the structural parts of the style of homes and buildings the Han and later Chinese groups brought. This list is quite robust with structures and architectural elements. The Chinese style tiles, if you see tile here, have been found at the Golua site possibly as early as 200 BCE. But the Han style model homes that I showed before, they suggest more likely that these words were borrowed from the early to first several centuries in the first millennium. Let's consider household objects now. These objects here from this period could represent the kinds of material culture Vietic groups in the Red River Delta saw when Sinitic groups arrived. Studies of Han Dynasty period objects are numerous, but descriptions of archaeological artifacts from northern Vietnamese excavations contain somewhat less detail, and I still need to keep searching. The lexical data, however, provides quite a bit of detail. And in the subcategory of household items here, there are bedroom items, personal objects, musical instruments. On the next page, there will be various implements and items of literacy. This data suggests that the Chinese style bedroom, including bed, mosquito net on the next page, chair, entered at least part of the Vietic community from an early period. Here it is, mosquito net there. We can speculate a scenario of the borrowing of these kinds of household words as the historian Keith Taylor's proposed Sino-Vietnamese families in this early period. I would suggest, however, we use that term Sinitic Vietic, since this was early in the Chinese dispersal and before Vietnamese or possibly even Viet-Muong. Let's transition to, oops, on a very notable type of Chinese loanword is that of containers. In this category, there are 10 nouns and 1 relevant verb. They have a variety of functions from storage of items, storage of animals, storage of substances, processing of substances. Again, there was a smaller number in the Vietic side, and so this seems to have changed that semantic domain substantially, at least in certain parts. Not surprisingly, there are many early Chinese loanwords for decorations and art, including a dozen nouns and several verbs. As you can see here, there is a rich range of terms for decorations, textiles and materials. This is a very vivid lexical, evidence of the introduction of visual sociocultural practices. I've included this list of manufacturing implements. As I said, I cast a wide net. Presumably some of these items are for artisans, not only homeowners themselves, but still relevant to the topic. As for clothing, the early Chinese text, the Ho Han Shu, I guess that would be Hao Han Tu, describes the mandating of Chinese style clothing in the 1st century CE. We cannot say with any precision how much impact such a mandate had on Vietic society, but here we see a full set of clothing in the terms, literally from head to toe, from hats to socks. Wearing such items associated with these terms is a very socioculturally significant change from those represented by the Vietic terms. In fact, in this the subdomain of terms related to silk, this subdomain contains a solid core of Chinese loanwords. This includes textiles, core items, some insects, the verb to slough for that insect, the silkworm. I've included, I think, I've included some probable introduced color terms associated with the silk cloth, so to get an entire semantic domain picture here. And on the issue of colors, there are definitely later Chinese loanwords for colors. So it was not only in this early period, but the color term system in Vietic had already started seeing impact from this early period in the first millennium CE. The early Chinese loanwords for prepared foods, food implements related to foods, and actions in the consumption and production of food are telling of sociocultural changes in the region in this early period. I have not been able to check the history of every single item, but many of these proposed early Chinese loanwords are confirmed in historical texts and archaeological evidence. Indeed, recipes and lists of ingredients have been written, were written in Chinese texts from the pre-Qin Zhou dynasty onward. But like early Vietic terms for produce, ethno-archaeological data does not always suggest precise timing or locations of the origins and spread of these types of produce. So it's certainly murky. Notably, there are two terms for green leafy vegetables, the greens in the middle, and it's green, the kai and zed. Which are lacking in Vietic reconstructions. And as I mentioned, there is a possible Dai origin of the Vietnamese word muong, water spinach. I hope archaeological evidence can clarify the implications of this linguistic data. Finally, here is a list of possible early Chinese loanwords for domesticated animals, including mammals, birds, and insects. And by the way, insects are not normally borrowed widely there's statistical evidence on that, but these are domesticated, and so it's a different reason for being borrowed. It seems that the number of terms for domesticated animals rose considerably within a few hundred years of Sinitic Vietic language contact in the Red River Delta. So, some concluding ethnolinguistic inferences. Middle Age Vietic, while available Vietic reconstructions show a primarily Neolithic lifestyle. Archaeological evidence makes clear that the Han Dynasty expansion into the Red River Delta and Tanhua occurred when the region was well into the Metal Age. Thus, early Chinese settlers likely saw a range of lifestyles from proto-urban Kolwa site, that site, to villages elsewhere. The amount of lexical borrowing due to Sinitic Vietic language contact in the first several centuries CE was neither superficial nor overwhelming. Even the most Sinicized of Vietic languages in the region were far from re-lexified virtual Chinese dialects. Nope, not at all. However, lexical and ethnohistorical and archaeological evidence combine to suggest very tangible sociocultural influence in the ancestral speech community of modern Vietnamese and Viet-Muong, not Vietic specific, broadly. One must assume these included Taylor's hypothesized Han Viet families as per Phan 2013, a socioculturally prominent bilingual community must have been a continuous part of northern Vietnam. So we can make ethnohistorical inferences based on this lexical evidence. We see largely Neolithic elements in the Vietic etyma, but Metal Age features more clearly in the Sinitic stratum. We see an Austroasiatic cultural type in the Vietic reconstructions versus the Chinese cultural type. The core set of cultural accoutrements received an added range of Chinese-style material culture. Vietic has terms for indigenous produce and domesticated animals, while the early Chinese layer shows introduced terms for types of produce and domesticated animals. But what was the linguistic situation in the proto-urban Gola dwelling, which was already a Bronze Age or even early Iron Age society with considerable wealth and many artisans and such? So some final questions here, and this image here of the tap, also a Damsun bronze item. The reconstructed Vietic data is to a good extent limited to that found in rural Vietic languages. It's sort of a natural effect of data collecting and reconstruction. However, for some deep history Austroasiatic etyma, the only available comparable attestations are in Vietnamese, not the other groups, leading to reconstruction of such words in Vietic. Even with just in Vietnamese, I can feasibly reconstruct it if it was in Austroasiatic. What other words may be original Vietic etyma found only in single groups in this way? Where is the lexical evidence specific to the Vietic spoken in the proto-urban Gola location? Is a word such as tap, situlum, this image here, which is well represented in northern Vietnam during the Dam Sun, such evidence? And what impact could such lexical data have on our understanding of the sociocultural situation during the Han expansion into the region? So that's what I have to offer, and I will stop here and give time